The year is 9 AD. A group of Germanic tribesmen, led by Arminius, a former Roman auxiliary and chieftain, ambushes 3 Roman legions under the command of Varus, effectively ending Rome's expansion into Germanic territories. The Germanic fighters' unrelenting guerrilla tactics took advantage of the Romans' incapacity to establish traditional battle lines in the treacherous terrain they made their way through, tight, marshy forest paths in the midst of torrential pouring rains. The Romans were utterly destroyed over the course of several days, and Varus took his own life to evade being captured. The end of Roman expansion east of the Rhine and the sharp demarcation of cultural and political borders between Roman-controlled Western Europe and the Germanic tribes in the east were both profoundly impacted by this catastrophic failure, an embarrassment that the Romans held in bitter memory for quite some time. Welcome to the channel. For the newcomers, good to meet you. Those returning, here we go again. Supporting the channel is just as easy as enjoying it, and I hope you're already doing that. Like and subscribe helps other people know that you want them to enjoy it too, and further to that, if you feel inclined, take a look at the description. There's a few links that you may find relevant to you. But first, let's get nice and relaxed, because we're going all the way back to a very dark day for the Romans. The Roman Republic, especially under the leadership of Julius Caesar, expanded greatly in the 1st century BC. Between 58 and 50 BC, Caesar achieved victory in the Gallic Wars, fought up in Gaul, kind of modern-day France, which allowed him to conquer a sizable chunk of Western Europe, and he even got to the British Isles. Well, combat with various Germanic tribes was of course part of the Gallic Wars, but they mainly involved the Gauls. There were 2 occasions when Caesar crossed the Rhine to fight Germanic tribes, but both times the results were tactically uncertain. When Caesar's civil war began in 49 to 45 BC, all of his military campaigns had to be put on hold. Well, following the Gallic Wars, continental Europe was largely neglected for the subsequent 20 years due to ongoing power conflicts within the Republic. Too many troubles at home to be thinking about abroad. But in 31 BC, the troops that were previously stationed in Gallic lands were withdrawn in preparation for the decisive confrontation between Octavian and Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium. The Gauls required no additional encouragement and immediately revolted. They were pretty good at doing that. The re-establishment of Roman control did not reoccur until 28 BC. Well, in 27 BC, Gaul and Rome experienced significant transformations. The Roman Republic underwent a reorganization and transformed into what was known as the Roman Empire. Yes, they are 2 different things. A republic is different to an empire. I won't go into it now. But we need to draw that line. A lot of people think that the Roman Empire was just always what it was. Well, the Roman Empire now was with the new guy, Octavian, officially being proclaimed as the inaugural emperor. Now Octavian, who was now known as Augustus, sought to centralize his authority over Gaul and partitioned the area into 3 smaller administrative divisions, a little bit more easy to manage. The reorganization highlighted the strategic significance of the Rhine Valley. Augustus maintained a military presence near the Rhine, yet his approach to Germanic territories remains a little ambiguous. There are 2 primary theories that do exist. One suggests that Augustus aimed to solidify the Rhine as the empire's northern boundary. And it's not a bad boundary. You always want a river. It's very hard for people back then to cross it, especially if they're not familiar with bridge building technology or boat building technology. And, well, the typical Roman looking down upon the quote-unquote barbarians would assume that crossing a river would be just too much of a difficult task for them. Several times they were proved wrong, but, well, you always learn the hard way, don't you? Well, the second perspective suggests that the border was a little bit more flexible, and the troops were primarily concerned with upholding order within the empire, rather than actively preventing the Germanic incursions. Well, whichever way it was, the Germans operated without any apparent consequences, as demonstrated by the overwhelming defeat in the Clades Lolliana in 16 BC. The Roman forces' defeat in the Lollian disaster led to the reorganization of the legions in Gaul, which was completed by 12 BC. Augustus now endeavored to subdue the Germanic tribes and initiated preparations for a military campaign in Germanic territory to prevent further embarrassments. He appointed his stepson, Drusus I, as the governor of Gaul. Drusus engaged in military operations against the Germans from 11 to 9 BC, and he was bloody good at it. He achieved a consistent string of triumphs, despite significant challenges. In fact, they should talk about him a little bit more. Maybe I'll do a video on Drusus. Everyone always talks about Caesar in Gaul. Well, perhaps it's because Caesar lived a little bit longer to tell about it. You see, the premature demise of Drusus, caused by a riding mishap in 9 BC, well, that's not the best and most heroic way to go. And it once again halted the progress of territorial expansion into the Germanic tribes. Tiberius, the older sibling and subsequent ruler, was appointed as commander of Germany in 8 BC, and he carried on his brother's military operation against the Sugambri, effectively expanding Roman control, even if not officially recognized. However, he lost favor and opted for voluntary exile in 6 BC. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, who had previously served as consul in 16 BC, took over as his successor. Ahenobarbus quelled several regional rebellions and successfully traversed the Elbe River, making him the sole Roman general to achieve this feat. As the end of the 19th century neared, the Romans became complacent and believed that the Germanic lands were safe due to the prosperous trade and a period of relative tranquility. Now that's a foreshadowing if you've ever heard one, isn't it? Well, we jump forward a little bit to 6 AD. Legatus Gaius Sentius Saturninus and consul Legatus Marcus Aemilius Lepidus commanded a formidable army consisting of 13 legions and of course their support staff, adding up to approximately 100,000 individuals. This force included 65,000 heavily armed infantry soldiers, 10 to 20,000 cavalrymen, archers, and 10 to 20,000 non-military personnel. Their objective? Confront Maroboduus, the ruler of the Marcomanni tribe, which was part of the Suebi people. Subsequently, Tiberius was compelled to divert his focus towards the Bellum Battonianum, alternatively referred to as the Great Illyrian Revolt, that erupted in the Balkan region of Illyricum. The campaign, under the leadership of Bato the Daesitiat, Bato the Brusian, Pines of Pannonia, and with participation of some Marcomanni forces, spanned almost 4 years, and they weren't good ones. Tiberius was compelled to halt his military operation against Maroboduus and acknowledge him as the king, and this was done in order to deploy his 8 legions to suppress the uprising in the Balkans. Sacrifices have to be made. It's always a long game with the Romans. Well, following his arrival back in Rome, Arminius assumed the role of a reliable consultant to Varus. However, covertly, he established a coalition of Germanic tribes that, historically, had been adversaries. These tribes likely consisted of the Cherusci, Marsi, Chatti, and Bructeri. These were a few of the, perhaps 50 or so Germanic tribes during that period. Arminius successfully united the disorganized groups who had been reluctantly accepting Roman rule by capitalizing on their anger towards Varus's oppressive behavior and brutal treatment of the conquered. He maintained this alliance until the most favorable moment to launch an attack. The most formidable enemy of Rome, right under Varus's nose, sitting right next to him in all those briefings, all those little dinner parties. He was right there all along. Well, after the relocation of 8 of the 11 legions stationed in Germania to the Balkans, only 3 legions remained to confront the Germanic tribesmen. Arminius saw this as the ideal chance to vanquish Varus. During Varus's journey from his summer camp located west of the river Weser to the winter headquarters near the Rhine, he received false information about a local uprising, and this information was deliberately spread by Arminius. Now Varus was deceived into believing that he needed to urgently attend this event, without being aware that it was actually a planned uprising by the nation. Varus continued to view Arminius throughout all of this as his obedient subordinate, the good little barbarian who's wearing the Roman clothes, the protege, almost. Meanwhile, he's just waiting for his time to strike. Well, I suppose you kind of barrack for the underdog, don't you, sometimes? Let's see how it turns out. The Varian disaster, bit of a spoiler alert, is named after Publius Quinctilius Varus, that Roman commander who was appointed as quaestor by Emperor Augustus in 22 BC. Let's talk about him a little bit. Get to know him. Well, Varus later became governor of Africa and Syria, which were of course very difficult occupations due to the political struggles in the Eastern Empire and its border nations. But he proved himself as a very capable governor, acting to solve the succession crisis after Herod the Great's death in 4 BC. His ultimate performance as governor is disputed by contemporary sources, though, with Josephus giving a positive view of Varus, while Varius Paterculus accuses him of corruption in office. Perhaps the truth is somewhere in the middle. Well, Varus's name and deeds were well known beyond the empire because of his ruthlessness and crucifixion of insurgents, which was, of course, the style at the time for the Romans. It was not uncommon to just be crucifying everybody. Of course, back then it had nothing to do with Christianity until Christianity actually came about and it became a symbol of it. Well, anyway, while he was feared by the people, he was highly respected by the Senate. He initially commanded 5 legions, plus auxiliaries in Germania, where he had previously been led by General Gaius Sentius Saturninus. The other 2 legions in the winter quarters of the army at Castrum Moguntiacum were led by his nephew, Lucius Nonius Asprenus, and perhaps Lucius Aruntius. Well, Varus initially commanded 5 legions plus those in Germania, which represented about 20% of the frontline Roman army. However, it's unclear about how many men were truly under his command at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. Estimates generally range from 20 to the high end of 30,000. Of his 5 starting legions, only 3 were under his command at the battle, supported by 9 small auxiliary units, so we're talking 15,000 and 4,500 men respectively. Winter attrition due to casualties, illness, and other causes would have, of course, sapped the legion's strength. Well, the main Roman army was highly professional, of course, outfitted by the state. They were given standardized weapons and armor consisting of a gladius, which is like a short sword, a large shield, and a pilum. You know those javelins that they have? The big ones with the big wooden head on them. That's called a pilum or pilum, I think. Now, they also had their standard Roman helmet, a mail shirt, and also some segmented armor. So pretty serious stuff, especially compared to the barbarians, who would have very minimal armor, if any, and come running at you with any weapon they could have. There was no real standardization. Oh, and one other thing, too. There seems to be a misconception that, the longer the sword, the better it's going to be, the more damage you can cause. But actually, a short sword is more practical in these close combat situations. You think about it, with this long sword, you can't get the swing on it, and you can't draw your arm back far enough to actually effectively stab somebody. The gladius was the perfect length. It was in that Goldilocks zone of fighting in close quarters. Think about it. Especially when you're in such a tight space. The barbarians coming at you with spears. So long they're not practical. Well, we could go on about the gladius all day, but maybe that's for another video. Well, the auxiliary units were not outfitted by the Romans, by the way. They had to bring their own stuff, and often They would represent the equipment and fighting style of their homelands, which pretty much put them on par with Germanic troops. So there was no real advantage there. Now let's talk about Arminius of the Cherusci tribe. Well, he was in a strong position to understand Roman tactics and strategy. In fact, he was taken hostage by the Romans after Drusus defeated the tribe in combat in 8 BC, when Arminius would have been around 10 years old. He received an aristocratic education in Rome, and he was also the son of a nobleman, even though he was a hostage. When he eventually came of age, he joined the Roman cavalry, Ordo Equestor, which would later lead to his appointment as a commander of the Roman auxiliaries. And by 4 AD, he was serving in Pannonia, in the northwestern Balkan states, and soon after he returned to his homeland in Germania, still nominally loyal to Rome. The size of Arminius's forces is a guessing game at best. We don't really have any written records of the Germanic peoples, at least not written records from the Germanic peoples. But estimates widely range based on the starting assumptions. Now, modern historian Adrian Murdoch suggests a force of about 25,000. Now, they also suggest that that army may have been pulled from a very large area, and each tribe probably had about 6,000 to 8,000 fighting men, for a total of 20,000 to 30,000. Not a bad force, but I suppose it depends on the gear. Of course, it wasn't all just about who was there. It was about the conditions. The seasons and the weather played a significant role in ancient conflicts too. There was a reason why people didn't fight in the winter. Armies would normally return to winter camps in October, after a campaigning season that started in March. Varus prepared a basic campaign for the following year, during the winter of 8 to 9 AD. Dispersed units of the army would assemble at Vetera, transverse the Rhine, resupply garrisons en route, and establish a summer camp in the Cherusci lands, which were nominally pacified at the time, at least they thought so, to prepare to launch for their summer operations. But unfortunately for Varus, he was already the victim of a betrayal. Arminius, who remained Varus's reliable confidant, plotted to establish a summer camp on Cherusci property. Since the Romans would have a long journey back to their winter headquarters from Arminius's homeland, the Cherusci could keep a close eye on them during the summer. Then, on their long way back, the Romans could be surprised in terrain that was friendly to the Germanic side. It's unclear when Arminius made the decision to rebel against Rome. It might have happened when he was a hostage, or even during his service in Germania under Varus, but no one can really know for sure. By the time he started tricking Varus and enlisting Germanic chieftains in early 9 AD, we know that he had already decided what he was going to do. Arminius had to gather a coalition of tribes to fight what might have been a long war, because he probably didn't even think that he could win outright against the Romans. Following Varus's orders, the Roman army emerged from their winter quarters in March. The army was plagued by logistical challenges, and the security was pretty weak. And it was winter, it was cold. Give him a break. Well, the precise site of the summer camp is a mystery, although it was likely close to or even at Minden in Germany in those days. Now, according to historical accounts, Varus did not engage in any significant military operations that summer, opting instead to hold court and handle political and legal matters pertaining to the Germanic tribes, do all the paperwork, you know what I mean. Well, the veracity of the narratives on several grounds are questionable, including the fact that Paterculus was the sole contemporary chronicler to write about the summer, and that he had good reason to write some pretty disparaging things about Varus. Since other accounts were based on Paterculus's account, they too carried his bias. Well, whatever the case may be, the summer was likely like any other for the troops, who would have been busy drilling or working on civil engineering projects, like fortifying local roads. For Arminius and his auxiliaries, who were attached to the main Roman army, the summer was a pivotal time for them. Throughout those early days of the season, he patiently waited for the right moment to set up an ambush, but of course time was of the essence. As a result, he gave the order to begin Roman raids in July. Then he advised Varus to send a small group of soldiers to quell the rebellion. Varus capitulated, dividing his army in two. Arminius went another step further by coordinating for his Cherusci auxiliary to join Roman work parties, act normally around them, and then betray them while they were working. Well, Varus really should have seen a higher need for security at this time, or noticed that there was a bigger scheme at play. But he just didn't. One can only imagine the Germanics whistling and twiddling their thumbs and slowly pulling knives out of their coats. Too bad for the Romans. Arminius's father-in-law, Segestes, told Varus about Arminius's betrayal, you know, and all of Arminius's meticulous preparations almost fell apart. Perhaps because Segestes had a grudge against Arminius for disapproving of his daughter's marriage. But either way, Varus did not believe him. Well, he probably should have. The growing sense of unease took center stage as the summer drew to a close. Unfortunately for Varus's other counselors warned him that the season was running out of time to quell the unrest and return to winter camp. Because the Romans would have to turn around before the Germanic forces could be assembled, and because they would have to retreat along the same heavily fortified route they had entered, Arminius's plans would have been thwarted. But as a last-ditch gamble, Arminius proposed that they would go on a campaign against the Angrivari instead of turning the army around. That way, they could accomplish both objectives. You see, the Romans, if they did this plan, could put down the uprising and take a shorter route back by passing through the Angrivari territory. Perhaps inspired by Arminius's plan, Varus decided to take action during the otherwise dull summer. The Roman army assembled for departure on the morning of September 7th, 9 AD. A large quantity of coins were distributed to the army as a result of the muster being combined with the third payday of the year. Sure, everybody was very happy. Even after 2 millennia have passed, the abundance of coins would still be a telltale sign of the battlefield for archaeologists. Coins do not rot away. Well, the news that the Angrivari campaign could engage in looting was a morale boost for the troops too, as they would be operating beyond their supply lines. Later that day, Arminius informed Varus that he was temporarily withdrawing to complete the muster of the Cherusci auxiliaries. But don't worry, he'd be back with the main army in a couple of days. Spoiler alert, he was not back. Went out to the store for a liter of milk and never returned. Our Arminius. Oh, Varus believed him, of course. He was loyal up to now. Either way, this was their final meeting. Although Arminius officially designated a small group of Cherusci as guides, their actual mission was to serve as spies. When Arminius was gone, the Roman army was reduced in size by 25%, and its capacity for reconnaissance was severely diminished. Riding northward, Arminius personally gathered the Angrivari and Bructeri forces. On the morning of the 8th of September, the Roman army packed up and proceeded to navigate through the dense forest in the area. This hindered their progress and caused the army to spread out over a great distance. The task of Arminius was now to ensure that the Romans advanced towards Calchris, where the Angrivari were waiting in ambush. In pursuit of this objective, his Bructeri allies launched a coordinated assault on the Roman army throughout its entire formation in the late morning. The procession was now dangerously extended, spanning a distance of approximately 15 to 20 kilometers. It's about 9 to 13 miles. Well, at that time, the state was assaulted by Germanic warriors who were equipped with swords, lances, and narrow-bladed short spears. The assailants encircled the entirety of the Roman army and unleashed a barrage of javelins upon the trespassers. The skirmish was short and intended to exhaust the Roman troops while inflicting significant damage to their supplies. The Bructeri retreated rapidly, presumably bringing along the Cherusci infiltrators who were embedded within the Roman army. Well, it just got worse for the Romans. Their fortunes deteriorated further as a torrential downpour commenced. Due to the inability to progress, Varus issued the command for the army to establish a camp. A robust encampment was constructed, and Varus convened a military council. Initial casualty reports indicated minimal losses. However, it was evident that the baggage trains and scout cavalry were especially susceptible. The Romans embarked on a night march in an attempt to flee, but they inadvertently fell into another snare that Arminius had strategically laid at the base of Calchris Hill. The Romans were limited in their ability to march by the narrow strip of sandy open land which was squeezed by the hills. It resulted in a gap of approximately 100 meters between the woods and the swampland at the edge of the great bog. A trench obstructed the road, while an earthen wall had been constructed along the roadside towards the forest, providing the Germanic alliance with a concealed position to launch attacks. The Romans made a futile endeavor to breach the wall, but they were unsuccessful. And the second in command to Varus, Legatus Pneumonius Valla, deserted the soldiers by taking his cavalry and fleeing. Despite his attempts to withdraw, he was ultimately caught up by the Germanic cavalry, and they made sure that he did not get away. While the Germanic warriors subsequently charged and in an aggressive assault on the battlefield, resulting in the annihilation of the already crumbling Roman forces. Varus, he took his own life, knowing that the writing was on the wall. Also, Praefectus Caeonius, a commander, also surrendered, but took his own life later, perhaps in captivity. Well, the number of Roman casualties has been approximated to be between 15 and 20,000. Additionally, it's been reported that the numerous officers chose to end their lives by impaling themselves with their swords. Tacitus reported that the Germanic forces engaged in indigenous rituals that involved numerous sacrifice. These officers were cooked in pots, and their bones were utilized for ceremonial purposes. Some individuals were redeemed, while it seems that certain ordinary soldiers were subjected to enslavement. But pump the brakes for a moment. Tacitus may have had a bias with this. You see, when the barbarians defeat you, well, you want to make them look as bad as possible. The same thing that they were doing with the Druids up in the British Isles. When you're trying to conquer a people, you want public opinion to be on your side. You want to be on the right side of history, so you paint them in this certain way. That's not to say that they were not cooking up the Romans in pots and basically inventing Italian food, quite literally, if we could say so. But yeah, once again, a little bit of a grain of salt with those ancient sources who sometimes have their own biases, just like modern historians do. Well, the Roman accounts emphasize the thoroughness of the Roman defeat, and also the discovery of 6,000 pieces of Roman equipment at Calcris, with only one item clearly identified as Germanic. Now that indicates minimal Germanic casualties. Nevertheless, it is probable that the winners may have taken away the corpses of their deceased comrades, and their tradition of interring their warriors along with their weaponry would have played a role in the scarcity of Germanic artifacts. Moreover, a considerable number of Germanic soldiers, potentially reaching several thousand, who had abandoned their militia duties, donned Roman armor. Consequently, these soldiers would give the impression of being quote-unquote Roman during archaeological excavations. Additionally, it's recognized that the Germanic tribes utilized perishable organic substances such as leather and possessed a lesser quantity of metal compared to the Roman legionaries. Well, what happened afterwards? Sure, some people got fired over this one, right? Well, subsequent to the triumph, there was a complete and thorough conquest of all Roman fortifications, military outposts, and urban settlements, at least 2 in number, located to the east of the Rhine River. The 2 Roman legions that remained in Germania, under the leadership of Lucius Nonius Aspinus, who was Varus's nephew, by the way, made an effort to maintain control over the Rhine River. The fort, named Adliso, which is believed to be situated in present-day Haltern am See, successfully resisted the Germanic alliance for a considerable period, possibly lasting several weeks, or even a few months. Following the situation becoming, well, unsustainable, the garrison led by Lucius Caedicius, along with survivors from the Teutoburg Forest, as few as they were, successfully breached the siege and reached the Rhine. They had successfully resisted, for a considerable period of time, allowing Nonius Asprenas to efficiently coordinate the Roman defense on the Rhine using 2 legions, and enabling Tiberius to arrive with a fresh army. This combined effort effectively prevented Arminius from crossing the Rhine and launching an invasion into Gaul. Upon learning of the defeat, Emperor Augustus is reported by the Roman historian Suetonius in the 12 Caesars as being greatly disturbed. Apparently, he had stood and forcefully struck his head against the walls of the palace, repeatedly shouting, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." Very frustrated, Arminius delivered the decapitated head of Varus to Maroboduus, the king of the Marcomanni, who was the second most influential Germanic leader. He then proposed an alliance against the Romans to Maroboduus, but Maroboduus refused, dispatching the head to Rome for interment, and maintained a neutral stance throughout the subsequent conflict. A brief and inconclusive war broke out between the 2 Germanic leaders only after that, and you would have thought that they would have teamed up. Strike while the iron's hot. Oh well. Despite the immense shock that was caused by the massacre, the Romans promptly initiated a deliberate and methodical procedure to prepare for the recapture of the territory. As usual, they weren't going to take it lying down. In the year 14 AD, immediately following the death of Augustus and the rise to power of his successor and stepson Tiberius, a large-scale attack was carried out by Germanicus, the nephew of the newly appointed emperor. And what a name for a man who was going out to get revenge on the Germanic people. He launched a surprise attack on the Marsi. The Bructeri, Tubanti, and Usipeti were provoked by the assault, and launched a surprise attack on Germanicus while he was en route to his winter encampment. However, they suffered a significant defeat and incurred substantial casualties. In the following year, there were 2 significant military operations, and a few minor skirmishes involving a substantial army of approximately 55 to 70,000 soldiers supported by naval forces. In the spring of 15 AD, Legatus Caecina Severus launched a second invasion against the Marsi, leading an army of approximately 25 to 30,000 soldiers and causing significant destruction. Subsequently, the soldiers under Germanicus's command constructed a stronghold on Mount Teonus, from which he led an expedition with an approximate force of 30 to 35,000 soldiers to confront the Chatti. A significant number of them escaped by crossing a river and scattered throughout the forests. Germanicus subsequently advanced towards Martium, the principal city of the tribe, and he burned the whole thing to the ground. Nothing personal, kid. Following early victorious encounters in the summer of 15 AD, which involved the apprehension of Arminius's spouse, Thusnelda, the military force proceeded to the location of the initial conflict. Tacitus reports the discovery of piles of whitened bones and detached skulls that were affixed to trees like a weird decoration. And it wasn't even Christmas yet. The people buried these remains, considering them to be relatives and part of their own lineage. And then Arminius was back. He launched an assault on the Romans at a place Tacitus refers to as the Pontus Longi, which are long causeways located in marshy lowlands near the Ems. And Arminius successfully ensnared Germanicus's cavalry in a strategic maneuver, but it caused limited harm. However, the Roman infantry promptly intervened, halting the retreat and containing the enemy forces. The conflict endured for a duration of 48 hours, with neither faction really making any headway. After this, Germanicus's troops retreated and went back to the Rhine. When 16 AD, Germanicus led the Romans to march into Germania again, accompanied by an additional army and Germanic auxiliaries who were their allies. Which you think they would have learned, right? I mean, after what happened, I would not be too keen to have German quote-unquote allies again. You never really know. Or maybe they didn't have German advisors again. Well, he compelled a passage across the Weser River close to present-day Minden, enduring casualties from a Germanic skirmishing contingent, and compelled Arminius's army to engage in a direct confrontation during the Battle of the Weser River. The legions led by Germanicus caused significant losses to the Germanic armies. The Angrovarian Wall, located west of modern Hanover, was the site of a decisive battle that followed the familiar pattern of significant Germanic casualties. As a result, the Germanic forces were compelled to retreat across the Elbe River. After successfully defeating the forces located between the Rhine and Elbe, Germanicus commanded Caius Silius to lead a combined force of 3,000 cavalry and 30,000 infantry to attack the Chatti and destroy their territory. Meanwhile, Germanicus himself, with a larger army, launched his third invasion of the Marsi and caused extensive damage to their land without facing any opposition. Having accomplished his primary goal, and with winter right around the corner, Germanicus commanded his troops to return to their winter encampments. However, the fleet had suffered some damage due to a storm in the North Sea. The North Sea is pretty notorious for that kind of thing. Subsequently, several additional military expeditions conducted across the Rhine led to the retrieval of 2 out of 3 of the legion's eagles that were lost in 9 AD. Specifically, 1 legion eagle was recovered from the Marsi in 14 AD, while the legion 19 eagle was recovered from the Bructeri in 15 AD by troops commanded by Lucius Stertinius. Tiberius commanded the Roman troops to cease their movement and retreat back across the Rhine, and Germanicus was summoned back to Rome and notified by Tiberius that he would be granted a triumph and reassigned to a different military assignment. Well, Tacitus recounted the final chapter. In approximately 50 AD, groups of Chatti forcefully entered Roman land in Germania Superior, potentially in an area located in Hesse to the east of the Rhine River, which the Romans seem to have maintained control over. The Chatti engage in acts of looting and pillaging. Secundus, a Roman commander, enlisted auxiliaries from the Vangiones and Nemetes, with the support of a legionary force and Roman cavalry. The Chatti were assaulted from 2 directions and subsequently vanquished. The conquerors, filled with elation, successfully located and emancipated Roman captives, among them individuals from Varus's legions who had endured captivity for a span of 4 decades. Arminius, well, he never gave up. He continued his resistance against the Romans, but the confrontation remained at a standstill. The whole thing was pretty lukewarm at this point, and people had lost morale. In 21 AD, he was poisoned by his own compatriots. It may have even been his own family. They were reportedly concerned about his growing autocratic tendencies. And you know what happens when someone grows too big for their boots. Well, thank you very much for listening. Wasn't that a thrilling tale, huh? It had everything. It had betrayal, Well, I suppose it just had lots of betrayal, didn't it? Lots of betrayal, lots of killing and violence. Oh well. That's enough for me, anyway. I'd like to thank my top-tier Patreon subscribers and supporters as Britt, Charles, Stark Factory, JC, Jeffrey, Wendy, Tim, James, Aaron, Scott, Dark, Ben, Kerry, and Melissa. Thank you very much to all of you. And thank you, listener, for getting this far. We always have lots of fun on this channel. And I will see you, same time, same place tomorrow. You know I'll be here. I'll see you then. Don't be late. Lots of love to you all.